Hey everyone, welcome back. Brand new Take Aim podcast. This week, excited to chat with Josh Honeycutt. Josh is the editor for Realtree.com. He is also, you probably saw his introduction last year on Midwest Whitetail. Josh has taken just a ton of great, awesome early season deer in Kentucky, and that's what we devoted this whole podcast to basically, is just how to shoot some of those awesome velvet whitetails down in Kentucky. Kentucky is so cool that the first weekend in September, their season opens, and sometimes guys get really lucky and, deer are still in velvet. But it's always been on my hit list, hunt down there during that time of year. But Josh really opened my eyes during this podcast about how effective that part of the year can be. And what a great time to pattern deer. You guys just have to listen in to some of the stuff Josh talks about in this podcast because it's just so much great information. So as always, hope you guys enjoy. Make sure to check out Josh on Facebook, Instagram, and follow him Realtree.com. But hope you guys enjoy the show. All right, boys and girls, we are live, brand new Take Aim podcast, and excited to have this guy on the phone with me today, Josh Honeycutt from Kentucky. And Josh is part of Midwest Whitetail, Realtree.com. Josh, I know you do all kinds of stuff, and I don't want to fudge things up, but I know you're editor for a bunch of other things and contributors, but to other magazines. But go ahead and kind of let everybody know what you do.
Yeah, I'm just a guy who likes deer hunt and tell stories about it. I'm an outdoor communicator full-time. I work as an outdoor writer, editor, photographer, videographer, working across medium platforms such as print, digital, social. Basically, if it has to do with outdoor communications, I've at least dabbled in it. So, that's kind of what I do for a living, and I'm blessed to work a job that I don't even consider it a job, but to have a career that I enjoy and love. So,
absolutely, I know for at least I don't know how many years now, 6, 7, or even longer, I've been seeing your stuff on Realtree.com, and last year I was super excited to kind of see you join Midwest Whitetail, so I could kind of keep up to date with what you're doing throughout the season. But how did that come about?
Yeah, so Realtree, has had a long-standing relationship with Midwest Whitetail. They've, Bill Winke, he's a great guy, and he's had a really good relationship with Realtree for years. Probably, definitely over a decade anyway. So. So it just seemed like a good fit, last summer whenever, we talked about potentially me joining the team. I've been filming my hunts and, for probably 6 or 7 years now anyway, and it just felt like a good fit. Like I said, I do a lot of other work for other outlets too, like North American Whitetail, Outdoor Life. I've written for about 50 to 60 different magazines and websites, but the primary one that I really work with the most is Realtree.com, and of course that relationship and partnership that Realtree has with Midwest Whitetail, it just made sense. And so last summer I started, working with them and contributing footage to that show, and I had a pretty tough season. It was probably the toughest season I've had in over 10 years anyway. But we're hoping to turn that around this year.
Yeah, for sure. I know that, like I said, I was excited to kind of see become part of that show, and like majority of the time I had followed you on Realtree.com or whatever, but I know, I'm sorry, Josh, forgive me, but was it last year or the year before you shot the really giant, gorgeous deer in velvet in Kentucky?
It was the year before.
Oh, okay.
Before. It was 2018, and that was a great opportunity and a really cool deer, and I've been fortunate to kill several velvet whitetails, 3 within the past 5 years, 4 to 5 years or so, but he's definitely the biggest. And I followed that deer beginning in 2017. He showed up just right after I killed a velvet 9-pointer during the 2017 season. Showed up a week or so after that, and he was big then. But I followed him throughout the whole season. Fortunately, he spent most of the time on the small property, and I'm a DIY guy. I have been fortunate to go on a handful of outfitted hunts and stuff like that, but I'm mostly a DIY guy. And, the properties that I hunt, most of them are under 100 acres. And, I do hunt a couple properties that are 100 to 200, but most of them are like 30, 40, 50 acre properties. And this particular property that this deer calls home was about 40 to 50 acres. So, it was pretty cool that he spent as much time as he did on that small piece of property. His core area was just right there. And it gets a lot of pressure around it too. But, luckily, fortunately for me, he survived the 2017 season and got way bigger in 2018, and I was able to self-film that adventure. So it was pretty fun.
Yeah, he's an awesome deer. I mean, just a ginormous mega, frame on him, and from top to bottom, vertically speaking, man, he just looks so huge. It's awesome. He's an awesome deer. So congrats on that. Amazing buck.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I kind of want to exactly talk about, and we can, talk about that deer a little bit and some of the things you've learned, but I always get real excited. And this year I was really pondering my options, even state lane in Kentucky to go down and do the early season. You guys start in September 1st. Is that correct, Josh?
Well, it's the first full weekend in September, so this year it'll be September 5th. Yep.
Gotcha.
Sometimes it's always that first full weekend in September. Sometimes I think in 2 years we'll have a September 3rd opener, September 2nd or September 3rd. But I always love it. The closer it gets to September 1st, the better, because you have a little bit bigger velvet window. And unfortunately, there's a whole lot of deer throughout the Midwest, especially. It seems like it's already shedding velvet, so that velvet window might be a little smaller this year.
Yeah, at least Michigan speaking, we are pretty right on that Labor Day weekend. It's a couple days before. You might catch one a couple days later, but it's always right there around Labor Day weekend. It's pretty remarkable. But what I was getting at is I've been, just the last couple of years, like I got to go do this Kentucky early season hunt one time, at least to say I've done it. And, to me, it's so super exciting that you guys start so early. But on the flip side, I was thinking about it today, just going over ideas for us to talk about. And I was like, man, it probably causes a little bit of stress for a guy, maybe not you, Josh, because you're used to that early season. But for a guy like me, I'm like, man, that's a 30-day window where it starts earlier. That's moving that whole scale of everything you had to do up quite a bit. There's no extra time for you, so to speak. You go right from summer to hunting deer.
Yeah, it's really a fun time, and honestly, it is my favorite time of deer season. That September is extremely underrated, and I think October is extremely underrated too. Everybody wants to spend those vacation days in November, but I am just as quick to cash those in early September, especially if I've got a deer on a really good pattern. So it's a different kind of challenge. It's much different than hunting in October and November, as everyone, I'm sure is aware. But it's just if you do your homework and you do the legwork on the front end throughout the summer, it can be one of the best times to fill a tag, even compared to the rut.
Yeah, for sure. And that's exactly kind of what I wanted to get into, Josh, is kind of how you do that. So your summer, we'll call it summer scouting, is that just your preparation for that first weekend in September? You're basically making plans for that first season, or are you kind of just doing a dialogue like, hey, this is the deer I have on this farm, the deer I have on that farm, and kind of building that story? Or is it strictly to like, hey, I'm going to get on this buck for opening week?
Yeah, a little bit of both, I think. It's kind of fun because you're talking about building that story, and I've been fortunate, especially the last decade or so, to kind of pursue deer that I've had multiple years of history with. And this year's a little bit less so. I only have a couple of deer really right now on camera that I'm aware of, maybe 3 or 4 that I have some multi-year history with. But that makes it way more fun when you do have those previous years to go back on, not only from a nostalgia purpose and a story perspective, but it's also really beneficial information and helpful information when you know what that deer's done in previous seasons, especially if it's a pretty habitual deer. But throughout the summer, I'm obviously trying to build those storylines, but as one might suspect, everything's with a purpose or for a purpose. And really the biggest thing that I like to do well before deer season is get as many stands hung as possible. Now, I do a lot of hanging hunts, and that big 2018 Velvet 8 that I killed was a hanging hunt. So, but I do like to have as many permanent sets hung as possible, and I do that well in advance, do all my scouting well in advance. But the big thing I do this time of year, and really from June, July, and August, is taking inventory. And I run about 40 trail cameras, and I'm not rich by any means. I buy a lot of cheap trail cameras, but that's what I've found that works for me. And having a bunch of trail cameras in the field, now obviously, you can't check them once a week. Got to be putting them in locations where they're easy to check without bumping deer, stuff like that. It still needs to be low impact, but that's one of the biggest things that I do leading up to deer season is putting out as many trail cameras as possible. And I hunt 4 properties here in Kentucky, and they range again from 40, 50 acres up to about 200. And I'll spread those cameras out over the properties that I have access to, and sometimes it fluctuates. Sometimes I'll have 5 properties, sometimes I'll have 4 properties, because I do a lot of by permission hunting. I don't own any ground. But I will basically just spread those cameras out and take as much inventory as possible.
Yeah, that's a great plan, and I'm glad that you said what you said about making it accessible to get to those cameras and making it easy so you're not bumping deer. But let's talk about some of those options, Josh. Are you basically doing a lot of the field edges, or how do you work some of those cameras during the summertime?
I kind of put my cameras in layers, and it takes more cameras to do this, but I like to have cameras in 2 stages. Most of my cameras, probably 20 or so, I can check from either a truck window, a four-wheeler, a bicycle, something. That way I don't have to lay a bunch of ground scent down to check those. I can check them from the back of an ATV or a vehicle and really minimizes my ground scent. Now, some ground scent still hits that ground if you're, on a four-wheeler or something, because scent falls. It's not just direct contact. Scent falls to the ground from your body. So really the only way to really reduce and eliminate that ground scent is to check it from a vehicle. That way you can keep the windows closed and everything like that, because if you're in a four-wheeler, that scent still falls to the ground. But that's what I like to do initially. And if I'm getting really good returns or really good card pulls on those cameras that are on the edges, on food sources, areas that I can check them easily from a truck, I won't go back and check the other half of my cameras. I won't check that camera, that layer of cameras that are just a little bit deeper. And generally where I put those secondary cameras in that second layer is in staging areas. I won't put them in bedding areas. Now, I will put trail cameras in bedding areas and let them soak for an entire year. But when I do that, I'm putting them in bedding areas back in during the postseason. So from February to May, that way I can put them in there well before deer season, not disturb those deer. And then I won't actually check those cameras again until the following year. And really that doesn't help me much for in-season data, but if it's a property that I am able to hunt for multiple years, and I think I'm going to be hunting for multiple years, having those cameras soak in those bedding areas is really beneficial, because you can go back and see how deer use those particular spots throughout the different phases of deer season, because different bedding areas are used more or less at different times of the year. So knowing exactly when deer are using particular bedding areas is extremely beneficial, especially when you have a long season like we have here in Kentucky, and you can hunt from September to January.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense for sure. So even some of your tier 2 or your staging area, Josh, how do you set those up? Is it kind of the same premise, or at least I would think? Are you using some sort of a good access to that staging area to where it may open up and you can be a little more quiet, or a big deer run that's been there forever that you can kind of sneak in and out of, or how do you manage it?
Sometimes I will slide in and check. It really depends on the situation. I like to, I think sometimes as an outdoor rider, I myself and many other outdoor riders and outdoor communicators are guilty of this. We try to make deer hunting too black and white. It's either this or that. But really, legalities aside, obviously follow deer laws. Those are black and white. But, when it just comes to tactical approaches, it's really shades of gray. And a tactic that might work in this scenario might not work in that scenario. So, like I said, most of the time I'm checking them from a truck or a four-wheeler. But if I know if I'm kind of in the core area of a really boogery deer that just does not tolerate really anything, and if I have a really good entry and exit route that I can slip in on foot really quietly to check that camera or pour that card or hang that tree stand or whatever it is, I will do that. Like such as if I can walk through a shallow creek bed all the way to that stand location or all the way to that camera to check it or to the stand to hang it, during the preseason. If I have a really good in and out that's not going to really, the deer's not going to know that I was there, I do prefer to do it on foot, because then you eliminate the visual factor, you eliminate the sound factor that you might have from an ATV or a vehicle. And obviously if you're walking through, and using water access, you're eliminating mostly the scent factor as well. So it really just depends on the particular scenario.
Yeah, no, those are great options for sure. And, sadly, we don't have as many kind of creek bottoms like you're talking about in Michigan, so that some of the access that we would use here is kind of what I mentioned. But obviously, if I had that option, man, that is the way to go, because, like you said, you're out of sight and kind of out of mind, and it keeps that scent to very minimal, which is, super important. But so on the, I guess, step 2, I'll call it, Josh, you kind of taking this inventory, and let's say you've patterned 1 or 2 bucks now, like what's the process then for this early first week in September?
Yeah, so as I'm finishing up here, we've got about 9 days or so. I think it's 9 days. But, we're really kind of getting down to the end of it, especially at this point. Generally, when it comes to the last bit of the scout, now I do a lot of glassing from afar too, because trail cameras are great, but there is nothing more valuable than sitting and watching a deer coming out into a bean field or into a food plot or into a hay field or whatever type of opening it might be. There is nothing more beneficial than being able to see that deer. So while trail cameras are a huge part of what I do during the preseason leading up to opening weekend, glassing from afar is a big aspect of it too. There's really 3 prongs of my preseason scouting. It's current trail camera information, scouting from afar, and historical trail camera information. So if I'm hunting a deer, which this year I am pursuing 2 or 3 different deer, I'll be potentially going after. Of course, we don't have one tag, but I'll be choosing one of these 2 or 3 deer to go after come deer season. And, fortunately, I do have some prior history with these bucks. And interestingly enough, a lot of what they're doing this season is pretty similar, not exact, but pretty similar to what they've done in previous seasons. So that's really the 3rd prong of my preseason scouting, is comparing this year's information to past year's information and really being able to go out and chart what these deer are doing. And one of the biggest reasons of having multiple trail cameras isn't so that I can just capture every particular buck that's on the farm. That's great, and it does help with that. But the biggest aspect and biggest reason of putting out as many trail cameras as you can and doing so responsibly with a low-pressure, system, low-impact system, is to create basically a timeline. So if you have enough cameras out that you can really get pictures of deer, like if they hit multiple cameras within 24-hour period, or especially if they hit multiple cameras in daylight or close to daylight, you can really use that and plot that information on a map, whether it's a digital map or a physical map, doesn't matter. But you can really take that information and plot that info and use those data points to really paint a picture how a deer is moving and traversing throughout a property. You can really connect the dots between bedding and food sources and water sources, this, that, and the other. So that's really what I'm doing right now leading up to opening weekend. Glassing from afar, still monitoring trail camera info, and really digging into past years too, just to confirm what I suspect. And again, I will say this too, when it comes to trail cameras, I'm very, very reserved. I'll put my trail cameras out here in June 1st, and generally when I put my cameras out for summer inventory, they're either over a mineral lick, a small corn pile, or they are over a scrape. And deer hit scrapes in the summertime too. So those are the 3 ways that I take inventory. It's legal here in Kentucky, so I do use that to my advantage when I'm taking inventory. But, I only check those cameras twice a summer. I will put them out the first week of June, then I'll check them the first week of August, and then I'll check them the last week of August, somewhere around 5 to 6 days before the opener.
Gotcha. That's a lot of good stuff right there. A lot of really good information. And one thing that I think, especially for you this year, Josh, is you're saying that you have that previous history, and that's one of the great reasons we run trail cameras, is to build a history with the deer. And so being that you have that this year, Josh, have you kind of dug into any of those, previous years, and have you put A to B together yet for a couple of these deer?
Some of them, yeah. There's three different bucks that I'm really kind of drilling down on. We're really fortunate here in Kentucky. I've been really blessed to hunt some good properties, and some of those are family owned, some of those are by permission. Just good relationships that I've built with people that I'm good friends with, in different scenarios. But there's three different bucks. One I have about 4 years of history with. He's a big 6.5-year-old deer this year at least. He might be 7.5. It was kind of interesting because sometimes these deer, they'll you might go a season and not see them, and then all of a sudden, boom, they show back up. And one deer that I call Acorn Top, I found his shed. You can see the shed on my Instagram page. I found his shed back in March in a clover plot, and he's a big deer. He's probably in the 60s, mid 160s this year. And it's funny because he does something different every year. So the prior history doesn't help me as much with that particular buck because I first started seeing that deer, I think it was in 2016 or 17. So I may only have 3 years of history. But then, 2017. 2017 would have been the first year I saw that deer. And then I didn't see him in 2018. And then he showed back up last year, and then he's back this year. So the prior history isn't, even though I have multiple years of history with him, he's doing something completely different every year. He's on the same property, of course, but he's utilizing the property much differently, even though the property hasn't changed from a logistics standpoint or a layout standpoint. But it's kind of funny, even though the prior history doesn't help with that particular buck. I do have a couple of other deer, which one I call Mr. T, and I've never been big on the naming game, but whenever it comes to trying to tell these stories, it does help to give each of these deer a name. That way, when you're telling the story, it's easier to identify them by. But this other deer that I call Mr. T, he is doing almost exactly what he's done in the previous seasons, and I have about 4 years of history with him. He's a 4-year-old deer this year, and I've had pictures of him ever since he was a 1.5 years old. So he's a pretty cool deer, and he's doing things that he's always done. I may or may not loose the arrow on that deer this year. I'd almost like to see him get one more year, although I'm not against shooting a 4-year-old if one walks by. But and then I've got a couple of other bucks that are pretty regular too. So yeah, that's a long-winded response, but
that's all right.
We'll be trying to tell those stories this fall with Midwest Whitetail, and hopefully one of those will come to fruition.
Yeah, absolutely. So Josh, on the buck you call Acorn Top, is it just going to be one of those things where you're kind of just covering all the bases, like, a high pressure system, the right wind, I'm going to go to here or there based on, like, maybe, you have had 1 or 2 encounters with them, or you're just going to kind of do the cat and mouse game? Because that's a heck of a buck, man. That was a great shed you found.
Yeah, he is. He's a cool deer. He's the one that I really want to hunt the most. But unfortunately, out of the 3 or 4 bucks that I have that what I labeled as target bucks, so to speak, he's the least huntable right now, and that's unfortunate because he's on the property, but he's spending a lot of time on the neighboring property too. So
okay, I was going to ask that next.
Yeah, this particular deer, while the other 3 bucks that I potentially might chase come season, those other 3 bucks their core areas are, right in the heart of the farm. And again, not big farms, 100, 200 acre farms. I think one's about 85 acres because all these bucks aren't on the same farm. But this particular deer, the number 1 target buck that I call Acorn Top, he's going to be the toughest one out of all. Of course, he's the oldest of the bunch. Now, I do have another deer that I didn't mention, which I call the Mystery 10. I had picked 1 photo of that deer back in 2018, and that was it. And I didn't see the deer again until this summer. And he is super regular, even though, despite the fact that he's not spent much time on the farm, or I've just been way off and completely missed him in previous seasons, he's all over the place this year. So, that's a good point too. Deer don't, even though some bucks will do the same things every year and are very habitual, other deer change their behaviors and patterns from season to season, even when it seems like they don't have a reason to. So that is something that I've noticed. Not every deer is going to do the same thing every year, but if you get one that does, that prior history is extremely beneficial because you can almost predict where they're going to be and what they're going to do. But, the acorn top buck, he's going to be a tough one to hunt unless he changes before the opener, because he is kind of, his core area overlaps both on the neighbor's property, I think, and mine, just based on, of course, I have a good relationship with that neighbor. I haven't talked to him about, what he's seeing or not seeing so far, but, based on what my trail cameras are telling me and those timelines that I talked about, how the deer hits multiple cameras, it really seems like he's coming from the neighboring property a good bit.
Gotcha. So I know that, you kind of mentioned it earlier, Josh, you called it the gray area, but I always kind of call it, which is a great term, but for the gray area, but, there's a rule for everything, an exception to that rule, I feel like. And do you feel like that is the case for early season? Like, do you hunt the mornings? Because you hear a lot of guys that, they won't hunt mornings all through October or until the rut starts or this or that. So what are your gray area for the start of the season? Do you do food in the evenings and dive into cover in the morning, or do you just avoid that altogether? What are kind of some of the scenarios you do when you're actually going to start hunting that week?
Yeah, you used to earlier on, whenever I was, early on in both my hunting career and in my outdoor communicator career, I was just like everybody else preaching, don't hunt the mornings during the early season. That's the good way to screw up the property. And it is. That's true. But especially in the last 5 to 6 years, probably, maybe the last 4 to 5 years, I've started hunting mornings a little bit more than I used to. And again, it's all about the scenario. Some properties you can't hunt them of a morning during the early season. Some properties you can't even hunt of a morning during the rut, if you don't have the right entry and exit, or if you don't have the right access. It just really depends, because every property every property deserves its own prescription as far as management plans and especially hunt plans. Because, some properties you may only be able to approach from one direction. When I'm hunting a property, I prefer to at least be able to approach from two sides of the property, if not three or all four. But generally, that's not the case. Generally, you can't do that. Most properties, you can only approach from one or two directions. So given that, it really sometimes limits whether or not you can hunt of a morning. But if I have a deer that's on a really good morning pattern, and I think that I can access a good stand location that puts me in the game without bumping deer, I'm not opposed to hunting that particular deer or that particular spot of a morning during the early season, even if it's right on a field edge. If I can access that stand without pressuring deer and it's a bulletproof entry route, I'll hunt it of a morning. Generally more times than not, if you're hunting of a morning, it's going to be back in the cover. It's going to be a little closer to the bedding areas or in a staging area, a travel route of some sort. But even if it is right on the field edge source and the deer are still, hitting those food sources late into the morning hours, I'm not opposed to that either. It's just all about the particular situation that I find myself in. And if I think that I have a legitimate, at least a 40 to 50% shot of seeing that deer within range without spooking it, or spooking it getting to that particular location or other deer, I'm not afraid to go after it. So it just depends on the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great answer, and that's exactly how, like you said, you just got to really take kind of the temperature of each property and then kind of, dive into that game plan from there, how you're going to hunt it and how you're going to go throughout the season with it. But I have a piece exactly kind of what you had mentioned a second ago about really only being able to access it one way, which, Josh, that over time, that's a killer. That's going to really kind of hurt your chances. And I was just thinking as you were saying that, like, I have some neighbors and I just need to get off my butt and get over there and ask them to get that access if I can, just politely, park somewhere and get in from a different side, because stuff like that is so important. But if you can do that, like you're saying, man, it can change the odds in your favor to, being successful. That's a huge change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, it's worth that effort, and I'm the same way. There are properties that I should be going and knock. Honestly, you should knock on every door on all four sides of the property, every neighbor. And that's something that is probably one of my Achilles heels too, because I'm somewhat of an introvert. So sometimes there's a little bit of an anxiety factor there, but and sometimes it's just pure laziness, at least on my part. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely worth the effort. Not everybody's going to grant that permission to access, but what I have found, because I have asked for permission to access properties from through lands that I couldn't hunt, and I have found that you do have a much higher odds of being able to access your property through another property than them allowing you to hunt. So don't just think that just because they've told you in the past that you can't hunt, being able to access through their property, they may be fine with that. So, you do have higher odds of being able to access through a property than to hunt a property.
Yeah, that is for sure. Absolutely. So, Josh, let's say opening week, which hypothetically, I hope you kill one, obviously, but hypothetically, it doesn't work out, you didn't see the deer you wanted to see, how do you kind of transition, moving forward through September and let's say just fast forward to October? Do you change that game plan, or do you keep kind of running that same similar plan with the cameras and let them do the work for you, and then you keep diagnosing those property and the deer?
Yeah, so I run my cameras throughout the season. However, I think at least based on the system that I've been using for the past 5 to 10 years, they kind of become less, I don't know, let's see, what's the right word? I think trail cameras become less potent throughout the season as the season goes on, at least leading up to the rut. Now, I think they become more potent again after the rut. But and I shouldn't say that they're less potent. That's really not true. But based on the way that I personally hunt, that they become less potent in some ways than others. But obviously I'm big on taking the inventory leading up to the early season, early September opener, and I take inventory throughout the year. And generally, whenever it gets in season, I'll check cameras about once a month, once every 2 weeks. At the very most frequent, it's every 2 weeks, and generally it's every 3 to 4 weeks throughout the season. And I will only check cameras most of the time when I hunt stand locations that are close to those cameras. Because you got your in one time to hunt it, you just go ahead and pull the nearby camera card while you're there and you get out. But I still take that inventory throughout the season from September to January. I think that's critical. But when it comes to transitioning into that early October period, deer are transitioning too. And a lot of people talk about the October lull, and they say that deer don't move in October. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Nothing against people who subscribe to that theory. And I'm not saying that they're wrong, because I'm not a biologist. But there have been some studies out there that show that deer gradually increase their movement and even their daytime movement throughout summer, into September, into October, and it peaks in November and coincides with the rut. So what I think what's happening in that October time frame is that deer really aren't necessarily moving less. I think what it has to do is that they're just moving differently. And so instead of calling it the October lull, I call it the October transition. And really what's happening is deer are transitioning off those field food sources like that alfalfa, those soybean fields, all those open green food sources that they've been hitting all summer long and into September. When you get to the end of September, and every situation is different, some soybeans will turn a little later, some, mass crops will drop a little sooner or a little later. But what's really happening is they're transitioning off of green food sources, and they're starting to hit those soft and hard massed food sources. And so generally speaking, where does soft and hard mass come from? It comes from trees. Where do deer generally bed? They generally bed in the timber. So they're not having to move as far to get to those food sources as if they would to get to those open field food sources and food plots that they've been on for the past, generally all of September. So that's really what I think is happening. They're transitioning off those green food sources, going to those hard and soft mass food sources, and hunters aren't transitioning with them. If most of the hunters who really subscribe to the October lull, they keep hunting those open fields, those food plots, those green food sources. They'll keep hunting those into October, and it can still work in October, but most of the deer are still going to be back into the timber closer to where they bed, because that's where the soft and hard mass is located.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that for sure. They definitely change a lot of things to me, during that September to October time frame, and movement is obviously one of them. And I think, like you said, just preferred food is so important to what some of that changes. And it's unique every year because we kind of see it, and then, like you said, that debate starts, Josh, about the lull or whatnot, but it never goes away, which is really funny. But I'm kind of prescribed to that theory, that same as you, that there's a lot going on in the deer's world in a short amount of time, September, October, November. So it just has always made a lot of sense to me about that, from bedding to food, and that's the case with deer. Is can you intercept them between those 2 points? And if they change that, and you haven't changed, that's one of the reasons you're not seeing deer in October.
Yeah, I think so. And again, I mean, researchers may come out tomorrow and say, yeah, the October lull is real, and if that's what they say, then I'll believe it. But it just hasn't been my experience, because I've had a lot of really good deer hunts in October. I had a really good encounter with a 160-inch deer last season in October, and it just didn't pan out. But it was really hot, really dry. I decided to hunt over a water hole that was pretty close to a bedding area, and the deer still had to travel probably about 100 to 120 yards from his bed to get there. But I think that's another big key, especially as you transition. While those deer might travel a couple hundred yards from their bed, maybe even 250, maybe even 300. And I'm not talking about out in the Midwest and Nebraska where they're traveling, 3/4 of a mile. But, in the East, Kentucky, if they're where you're at, I can't speak to Michigan because I've never hunted Michigan, but in Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, the areas where I've hunted the most, deer aren't really going to travel 4, 5, 6, 7, 800 yards, in daylight from their beds. It doesn't matter if it's September or October or maybe they will in November, but if it's outside of the rut, you're going to have to be within 100 yards of where that deer beds to really be in the game most of the time, with the exception of maybe that first week or two of September when those deer haven't really felt much pressure. And again, especially when you get into October, I think it's important to get even closer to those beds. And again, some people say, well, that's proof of the October lull. But again, I don't think it necessarily is. I think that just the reason that those deer aren't traveling quite as far from their beds in daylight is simply because the mass crops, are located close to those beds. So you kind of got to get closer to those beds than you would if you were hunting during September when they're traveling further to get to those green food sources. So, that's one of the biggest things I've found, whether hunting in September or October, is generally I want to try to set up within about 125, maybe 150 yards of where that deer is bedding at. Now, every deer is different. Every deer behaves differently. And if you have a deer that's moving 200 or 300, 400 yards in daylight, then definitely don't get close to that bed, because there's absolutely no reason to. But if that deer is kind of, if he's getting to your camera locations or stand locations right on the end of legal, you might want to get closer. And I'm not afraid. There was a really cool hunt back in 2016. I think it was 2016. Maybe it was 2017. No, it was 2016. Sorry. I actually got into a stand, climbed up the stand, and I had a bedded buck about 30 to 40 yards in front of me. So, and I was able to get all the way up in the stand, hang my gear up and everything without that deer even knowing I was around. So it's not impossible to get close to those buck beds. And again, I wouldn't have gotten that close. I didn't realize that's where that deer was bedding. I thought he was bedding about 80 to 90, 100 yards, beyond what he actually did. But, it's not impossible to get close to deer. And I think you can get closer to bedded deer than sometimes people think. Now, obviously, you've got to have really good entry routes to get there. They can't be able to see you, smell you, or hear you. So, again, every situation is different. Some bucks that are really smart and really savvy, they bed in locations where you can't get within 150 yards of them. So, again, it just depends on the particular scenario. But the biggest transition, the biggest thing that I do differently whenever I'm transitioning from September to October is I try to focus more on those soft and hard mass locations, and I try to get a little bit closer to those beds because they're not moving quite as far. They're still moving just as much. So, they're on their feet just as much during daylight in October as they are in September. But they're not moving quite as far because those food sources aren't quite as far. So those are the biggest differences, I think, in what I do in September versus early October.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are, great answers for sure, and that's a lot to learn from, and it makes a ton of sense, absolutely. Josh, you don't have to say, exactly where, but what part of the state in Kentucky are you from and where you're hunting?
Central Kentucky. Central,
okay. So compared, relatively speaking, I'm in southern Michigan. It's pretty flat. We're lucky to have any kind of elevation, So I know that you guys in Kentucky have a lot of elevation, a lot of changes. So how do you go about, or any tips just for that area and how you kind of combat some of the wind and thermals down there?
Yeah, I love where I hunt here in Kentucky because it's so diverse. Central Kentucky is right on that dividing line. So we get a little bit of western Kentucky and a little bit of eastern Kentucky. And, of course, eastern Kentucky is full of foothills, even mountains once you get all the way over to the eastern portion of the state. Western Kentucky is flat as a pancake. It's fence row country. So you've got a lot of big fields and fence rows with trees in them. So, we have a little bit of both right here in the central portion of the state, and every property I hunt is different. Some of them have some good elevation change, others don't. So every property I hunt's a little bit different. I do think it's, everybody talks about big timber. Everybody talks about, hill country and how it's harder to hunt. I think in some ways that's true because deer aren't necessarily as predictable in hill country, in big timber where they can, go in just about any direction and eat an acorn, or for those who like to say it, acorn. So that's just a little fun of the day. But I think in big timber, I think it is. I think it can be a little bit easier in some ways to hunt them in big timber in hill country than in flat country. So I think there's pros and cons to both. But to answer your question with thermals, obviously thermals plays a big part in areas with varying topography. And I hunt up in Ohio a lot, too. We've got a small property up in Ohio. I was fortunate to kill a nice 140-ish type deer back in January, right toward the end of the season, this past season. So, and there's a lot more topography and varying terrain there than there is even here in Kentucky because that's southeastern Ohio, and it's even more, hilly and even mountainous in some locations than here. So, whereas the thermals might not play as much of a factor and don't play as much of a factor here as they do up there, you will see that thermals do have at least a little bit of relevance even in flatter terrain because, of a morning when that sun starts rising, that temperature is going to pick them up. So it doesn't just apply to topography in my experience, but the more severe change there is, in those elevations, the more potent those thermals become. And one thing that I like to do is take advantage of water thermals too, because a lot of the times you'll notice that, especially in the evenings, a lot of the times, and it's not always in the evening. Thermals aren't just related to morning and afternoon. It's related to temperature change, but I'll take advantage of water thermals too, and sometimes you'll be able to see that your scent and your wind direction is sucking right down into a water source, especially if it's a stream or a creek or something like that. So sometimes I've noticed that regardless of what the wind direction is, your thermals will suck right down into that creek. So I do a lot of hunting, especially in areas where I don't have topography, to take advantage of traditional thermals. I will hunt over a creek, directly over a creek, or right beside of a creek or a stream, because I can really take advantage of those more predictable thermals and my scent, sucking down into that water source. It doesn't always work, but sometimes it does.
So when you say it doesn't always work, Josh, I assume there's a theory to that the water has to be moving at a certain clip, or temperature-wise, the water has to be, maybe the water has to be so deep so it's slightly cooler. There has to be, some rhyme or reason to that, but would that hold true?
Yeah, I think so, and I'm no complete expert on it, but what I've noticed, I think, and again, I could be wrong, I'm no complete expert, but what I've noticed that when there's a little bit less of a wind or no wind, it seems like those water thermals suck just a little bit harder, or they're a little bit, obviously they don't have any competition with prevailing winds or direct, wind directions. So whenever there's less wind, and there's less of that involved, it seems like my scent kind of falls toward those water sources just a little bit more than they would if you got, a 3, 4, 5, 6+ mile an hour wind.
Gotcha. Absolutely. Yeah, it does make sense.
And I may be off base with that, but that's just been my experience.
Yeah, I believe it, and I mean, I've been around creeks where that are bigger. Again, I'm not talking about just a little trickle of water, but I'm talking about a decent sized mass of water. That if I can actually feel that cooler temperature from that water, that it makes sense to me that would work. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
yeah, I mean, and again, if somebody has some research or an article they want to shoot to me, send it to me on Messenger. I've been wrong before, so and I have big shoulders, metaphorically speaking, anyway, so I can handle it when I'm not right about something. So if somebody out there wants to educate me or has a better explanation, please send it to me because I want to know.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Well, Josh, man, we're coming up on time. I just want to say thanks, for your time today, and I hope you have the best of luck with, Acorn Top and the rest of the deer you got going on, and hopefully you kill him, man, and I would love to have you back on the show.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. It's an honor that you had me on today. I appreciate it, and thanks for the well wishes and the good luck, and I hope the same for you. I hope you have a great 2020 season.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that. And as everybody knows, you can catch us live every week on iTunes, Outdoor Podcast Channel, Unfiltered Outdoor app. And Josh, we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.